Fyodor Dostoevsky, Bobok, from Somebody's Diary, a short story about the afterlife. Semyon Ardalyonovich said to me all of a sudden the day before yesterday, "Why will you ever be sober, Ivan Ivanovich? Tell me that, pray." A strange requirement. I did not resent it. I am a timid man, but here they have actually made me out mad. An artist painted my portrait as it happened. "After all, you are a literary man," he said. I submitted. He exhibited it. I read, "Go and look at that morbid face suggesting insanity." It may be so, but think of putting it so bluntly into print. In print, everything ought to be decorous. There ought to be ideals, while instead of that, say it indirectly at least. That's what you have style for. But no, he doesn't care to do it indirectly. Nowadays, humor and a fine style have disappeared, and abuse is accepted as wit. I do not resent it, but God knows I am not enough of a literary man to go out of my mind. I have written a novel. It has not been published. I have written articles. They have been refused. Those articles I took about from one editor to another. Everywhere they refused them. "You have no salt," they told me. "What sort of salt do you want?" I asked with a jeer. "Attic salt." They did not even understand. For the most part, I translate from the French for the booksellers. I write advertisements for shopkeepers too. Unique opportunity. Fine tea from our own plantations. I made a nice little sum over a panegyric on His Deceased Excellency Pyotr Matveyich. I compiled the Art of Pleasing the Ladies, a commission from a bookseller. I've brought out some 6 little works of this kind in the course of my life. I am thinking of making a collection of the bon mots of Voltaire, but I'm afraid it may seem a little flat to our people. Voltaire's no good now. Nowadays, we want a cudgel, not Voltaire. We knock each other's last teeth out nowadays. Well, so that's the whole extent of my literary activity, though indeed I do send round letters to the editors gratis and fully signed. I give them all sorts of counsels and admonitions, criticize and point out the true path. The letter I sent last week to an editor's office was the 40th I had sent in the last 2 years. I have wasted 4 rubles over stamps alone for them. My temper is at the bottom of it all. I believe that the artist who painted me did so not for the sake of literature, but for the sake of 2 symmetrical warts on my forehead, a natural phenomenon, he would say. They have no ideas, so now they are out for phenomena. And didn't he succeed in getting my warts in his portrait, to the life? That is what they call realism. And as to madness, a great many people were put down as mad among us last year, and in such language, with such original talent, and yet, after all, it appears. However, one ought to have foreseen it long ago. That is rather artful, so that from the point of view of pure art, one may really commend it. Well, but after all, these so-called madmen have turned out cleverer than ever, so it seems the critics can call them mad, but they cannot produce anyone better. The wisest of all, in my opinion, is he who can, if only once a month, call himself a fool, a faculty unheard of nowadays. In old days, once a year at any rate, a fool would recognize that he was a fool, but nowadays not a bit of it. And they have so muddled things up that there is no telling a fool from a wise man. They have done that on purpose. I remember a witty Spaniard saying when 250 years ago the French built their first madhouses, "They have shut up all their fools in a house apart to make sure that they are wise men themselves." Just so. You don't show your own wisdom by shutting someone else in a madhouse. K has gone out of his mind means that we are sane now. No, it doesn't mean that yet. Hang it, though. Why am I maundering on? I go on grumbling and grumbling. Even my maidservant is sick of me. Yesterday a friend came to see me. "Your style is changing," he said. "It is choppy. You chop, and then a parenthesis in the parenthesis. Then you stick in something else in brackets. Then you begin chopping and chopping again." The friend is right. Something strange is happening to me. My character is changing and my head aches. I am beginning to see and hear strange things, not voices exactly, but as though someone beside me were muttering, "Bobok, Bobok, Bobok." What's the meaning of this, Bobok? I must divert my mind. I went out in search of diversion. I hit upon a funeral, a distant relation, a collegiate counsellor, however, a widow and 5 daughters, all marriageable young ladies. What must it come to even to keep them in slippers? Their father managed it, but now there is only a little pension. They will have to eat humble pie. They have always received me ungraciously, and indeed I should not have gone to the funeral now had it not been for a peculiar circumstance. I followed the procession to the cemetery with the rest. They were stuck up and held aloof from me. My uniform was certainly rather shabby. It's 25 years, I believe, since I was at the cemetery. What a wretched place. To begin with the smell. There were 15 hearses, with palls varying in expensiveness. There were actually 2 catafalques. One was a general's, and one some ladies'. There were many mourners, a great deal of feigned mourning, and a great deal of open gaiety. The clergy have nothing to complain of. It brings them a good income. But the smell, the smell. I should not like to be one of the clergy here. I kept glancing at the faces of the dead cautiously, distrusting my impressionability. Some had a mild expression. Some looked unpleasant. As a rule, the smiles were disagreeable, and in some cases, very much so. I don't like them. They haunt one's dreams. During the service, I went out of the church into the air. It was a grey day, but dry. It was cold, too, but then it was October. I walked about among the tombs. They are of different grades. The 3rd grade costs 30 rubles. It's decent, and not so very dear. The first 2 grades are tombs in the church and under the porch. They cost a pretty penny. On this occasion, they were burying in tombs of the 3rd grade 6 persons, among them the general and the lady. I looked into the graves, and it was horrible. Water and such water, absolutely green and— But there, why talk of it? The gravedigger was bailing it out every minute. I went out while the service was going on and strolled outside the gates. Close by was an almshouse, and a little further off there was a restaurant. It was not a bad little restaurant. There was lunch and everything. There were lots of the mourners here. I noticed a great deal of gaiety and genuine heartiness. I had something to eat and drink. Then I took part in the bearing of the coffin from the church to the grave. Why is it that corpses in their coffins are so heavy? They say it is due to some sort of inertia, that the body is no longer directed by its owner, or some nonsense of that sort, in opposition to the laws of mechanics and common sense. I don't like to hear people who have nothing but a general education venture to solve the problems that require special knowledge, and with us that's done continually. Civilians love to pass opinions about subjects that are the province of the soldier and even of the field marshal, while men who have been educated as engineers prefer discussing philosophy and political economy. I did not go to the requiem service. I have some pride, and if I am only received owing to some special necessity, why force myself on their dinners, even if it be a funeral dinner? The only thing I don't understand is why I stayed at the cemetery. I sat on a tombstone and sank into appropriate reflections. I began with the Moscow exhibition and ended with reflecting upon astonishment in the abstract. My deductions about astonishment were these. To be surprised at everything is stupid, of course, and to be astonished at nothing is a great deal more becoming and for some reason accepted as good form. But that is not really true. To my mind, to be astonished at nothing is much more stupid than to be astonished at everything. And moreover, to be astonished at nothing is almost the same as feeling respect for nothing. And indeed, a stupid man is incapable of feeling respect. But what I desire most of all is to feel respect. I thirst to feel respect, one of my acquaintances said to me the other day. He thirsts to feel respect. Goodness, I thought. What would happen to you if you dared to print that nowadays? At that point, I sank into forgetfulness. I don't like reading the epitaphs of tombstones. They are everlastingly the same. An unfinished sandwich was lying on the tombstone near me, stupid and inappropriate. I threw it on the ground, as it was not bread, but only a sandwich, though I believe it is not a sin to throw bread on the earth, but only on the floor. I must look it up in Souverine's calendar. I suppose I sat there a long time, too long a time, in fact. I must have lain down on a long stone which was of the shape of a marble coffin. And how it happened, I don't know, but I began to hear things of all sorts being said. At first I did not pay attention to it, but treated it with contempt. But the conversation went on. I heard muffled sounds as though the speakers' mouths were covered with a pillow, and at the same time they were distinct and very near. I came to myself, sat up, and began listening attentively. "Your Excellency, it's utterly impossible. You led hearts, I return your lead, and here you play the 7 of diamonds. You ought to have given me a hint about diamonds." "What? Play by hard and fast rules? Where is the charm of that?" "You must, Your Excellency. One can't do anything without something to go upon. We must play with dummy, let one hand not be turned up." "Well, you won't find a dummy here." What conceited words! And it was queer and unexpected. One was such a ponderous, dignified voice, the other softly suave. I should not have believed it if I had not heard it myself. I had not been to the Requiem dinner, I believe. And yet how could they be playing preference here, and what general was this? That the sounds came from under the tombstones of that, there could be no doubt. I bent down and read on the tomb. "Here lies the body of Major General Pervoyedov, a cavalier of such and such orders. Passed away in August of this year, 57. Rest, beloved ashes, till the joyful dawn. Dash it, it really is a general." There was no monument on the grave from which the obsequious voice came. There was only a tombstone. He must have been a fresh arrival. From his voice he was a lower court councillor. "Oh, ho, ho, ho!" I heard in a new voice a dozen yards from the general's resting place, coming from quite a fresh grave. The voice belonged to a man and a plebeian, mawkish with its affectation of religious fervour. "Oh, ho, ho, ho! Oh, here he is hiccuping again!" cried the haughty and disdainful voice of an irritated lady, apparently of the highest society. "It is an affliction to be by this shopkeeper." I didn't hiccup. Why, I've had nothing to eat. It's simply my nature. Really, madam, you don't seem able to get rid of your caprices here. Then why did you come and lie down here? They put me here. My wife and little children put me here. I did not lie down here of myself. The mystery of death. And I would not have lain down beside you, not for any money. I lie here as befitting my fortune, judging by the price. For we can always do that. Pay for a tomb of the 3rd grade. You made money, I suppose. You fleeced people? Fleece you, indeed. We haven't seen the colour of your money since January. There's a little bill against you at the shop. Well, that's really stupid. To try and recover debts here is too stupid to my thinking. Go to the surface. Ask my niece. She is my heiress. There's no asking anyone now, and no going anywhere. We have both reached our limit, and before the judgment seat of God are equal in our sins. In our sins, the lady mimicked him contemptuously. Don't dare to speak to me. Oh, ho, ho, ho! You see, the shopkeeper obeys the lady, Your Excellency. Why shouldn't he? Why, Your Excellency? Because, as we all know, things are different here. Different? How? We are dead, so to speak, Your Excellency. Oh, yes, but still. Well, this is an entertainment. It is a fine show, I must say. If it has come to this down here, what can one expect on the surface? But what a queer business. I went on listening, however, though with extreme indignation. Yes, I should like a taste of life. Yes, you know, I should like a taste of life. I heard a new voice suddenly somewhere in the space between the general and the irritable lady. Do you hear, Your Excellency? Our friend is at the same game again. For 3 days at a time he says nothing, and then he bursts out with, I should like a taste of life, yes, a taste of life. And with such appetite, he, and such frivolity. It gets hold of him, Your Excellency, and do you know he is growing sleepy, quite sleepy. He has been here since April, and then all of a sudden I should like a taste of life. "It is rather dull, though," observed His Excellency. "It is, Your Excellency. Shall we tease Avdotia Ignatievna again, he? "No, spare me, please. I can't endure that quarrelsome virago." "And I can't endure either of you," cried the virago disdainfully. "You are both of you bores, and can't tell me anything ideal. I know one little story about you, Your Excellency. Don't turn up your nose, please. How a man's servant swept you out from under a married couple's bed one morning." "Nasty woman," the general muttered through his teeth. "Avdotia Ignatievna, ma'am," the shopkeeper wailed suddenly again. "My dear lady, don't be angry, but tell me, am I going through the ordeal by torment now, or is it something else?" "Ah, he is at it again, as I expected, for there's a smell from him which means he is turning round." "I'm not turning round, ma'am, and there's no particular smell from me, for I've kept my body whole as it should be while you're regularly high, for the smell is really horrible even for a place like this. I don't speak of it, merely from politeness." "Ah, you horrid, insulting wretch. He positively stinks and talks about me." "Oh, ho, ho, ho. If only the time for my requiem would come quickly, I should hear their tearful voices over my head, my wife's lament and my children's soft weeping." "Well, that's a thing to fret for. They'll stuff themselves with funeral rice and go home. Oh, I wish somebody would wake up." "Avdotia Ignatievna," said the insinuating government clerk, "wait a bit. The new arrivals will speak." "And are there any young people among them?" "Yes, there are. Avdotia Ignatievna. There are some not more than lads." "Oh, how welcome that would be." "Haven't they begun yet?" inquired His Excellency. "Even those who came the day before yesterday haven't awakened yet, Your Excellency. As you know, they sometimes don't speak for a week. It's a good job that today and yesterday and the day before they brought a whole lot. As it is, they are all last year's for 70 feet round." "Yes, it will be interesting." "Yes, Your Excellency, they buried Tarasevich, the Privy Councillor, today. I knew it from the voices. I know his nephew. He helped to lower the coffin just now." "Hmm. Where is he, then?" "5 steps from you, Your Excellency, on the left, almost at your feet. You should make his acquaintance, Your Excellency." No. It's not for me to make advances." "Oh, he will begin of himself, Your Excellency. He will be flattered. Leave it to me, Your Excellency, and I—" Oh, what is happening to me?" croaked the frightened voice of a new arrival. "A new arrival, Your Excellency. A new arrival, thank God. And how quick he's been. Sometimes they don't say a word for a week." "Oh, I believe it's a young man," Avdotia Ignatievna cried shrilly. "Aye, it was a complication, and so sudden," faltered the young man again. "Only the evening before, Schultz said to me, 'There's a complication,' and I died suddenly before morning. Oh. Well, there's no help for it, young man," the general observed graciously, evidently pleased at a new arrival. "You must be comforted. You are kindly welcome to our Vale of Jehoshaphat, so to call it. We are kind-hearted people. You will come to know us and appreciate us. Major General Vasily Vasilich Pervoyedov at your service." "Oh, no, certainly not. I was at Schultz's. I had a complication, you know. At first it was my chest and a cough, and then I caught a cold, my lungs an influenza, and all of a sudden, quite unexpectedly. The worst of all was its being so unexpected." "You say it began with the chest," the government clerk put in suavely, as though he wished to reassure the new arrival. "Yes, my chest and catarrh and then no catarrh, but still the chest, and I couldn't breathe. And you know—" I know. But if it was the chest, you ought to have gone to Ecker and not to Schultz. You know, I kept meaning to go to Botkin's, and all at once—" "Botkin is quite prohibitive," observed the general. "Oh, no, he is not forbidding at all. I've heard he is so attentive and foretells everything beforehand." "His Excellency was referring to his fees," the government clerk corrected him. "Oh, not at all. He only asks 3 rubles, and he makes such an examination and gives you a prescription. And I was very anxious to see him, for I have been told. Well, gentlemen, had I better go to Ecker or to Botkin? What? To whom? The general's corpse shook with agreeable laughter. The government clerk echoed it in falsetto. Dear boy, dear delightful boy, how I love you! Avdotya Ignatyevna squealed ecstatically. I wish they had put someone like you next to me. No, that was too much, and these were the dead of our times. Still, I ought to listen to more and not be in too great a hurry to draw conclusions. That snivelling new arrival, I remember him just now in his coffin, had the expression of a frightened chicken, the most revolting expression in the world. However, let us wait and see. But what happened next was such a bedlam that I could not keep it all in my memory. For a great many woke up at once. An official, a civil councillor, woke up and began discussing at once the project of a new subcommittee in a government department and of the probable transfer of various functionaries in connection with the subcommittee, which very greatly interested the general. I must confess I learnt a great deal that was new myself, so much so that I marvelled at the channels by which one may sometimes in the metropolis learn government news. Then an engineer half woke up, but for a long time muttered absolute nonsense, so that our friends left off worrying him and let him lie till he was ready. At last, the distinguished lady who had been buried in the morning under the catafalque showed symptoms of the reanimation of the tomb. Lebeziatnikov, for the obsequious lower court councillor whom I detested, and who lay beside General Pervoyedov, was called, it appears, Lebeziatnikov, became much excited, and surprised that they were all waking up so soon this time. I must own I was surprised too, though some of those who woke had been buried for 3 days, as, for instance, a very young girl of 16 who kept giggling in a horrible and predatory way. Your Excellency, Privy Councillor Tarasevich is waking, Lebeziatnikov announced with extreme fussiness. Eh? What? The Privy Councillor, waking up suddenly, mumbled with a lisp of disgust. There was a note of ill-humoured peremptoriness in the sound of his voice. I listened with curiosity, for during the last few days I had heard something about Tarasevich, shocking and upsetting in the extreme. It's I, Your Excellency. So far, only I. What is your petition? What do you want? Merely to inquire after Your Excellency's health. In these unaccustomed surroundings, everyone feels at first, as it were, oppressed. General Pervoyedov wishes to have the honor of making Your Excellency's acquaintance, and hopes— I've never heard of him. Surely, Your Excellency, General Pervoyedov Vasily Vasilich. Are you General Pervoyedov? No, Your Excellency. I am only the lower court councillor Lebeziatnikov at your service, but General Pervoyedov— Nonsense, and I beg you to leave me alone. Let him be. General Pervoyedov at last himself checked with dignity the disgusting officiousness of his sycophant in the grave. He is not fully awake, Your Excellency. You must consider that. It's the novelty of it all. When he is fully awake, he will take it differently. Let him be, repeated the general. Vasily Vasilich. Hey, Your Excellency! A perfectly new voice shouted loudly and aggressively from close beside Avdotya Ignatyevna. It was a voice of gentlemanly insolence, with the languid pronunciation now fashionable and an arrogant drawl. I've been watching you all for the last 2 hours. Do you remember me, Vasily Vasilich? My name is Kleinvich. We met at the Volokonskys, where you too were received as a guest. I am sure I don't know why. What, Count Pyotr Petrovitch? Can it be really you? And at such an early age? How sorry I am to hear it. Oh, I am sorry myself, though I really don't mind, and I want to amuse myself as far as I can everywhere. And I am not a count, but a baron, only a baron. We are only a set of scurvy barons, risen from being flunkies, but why I don't know and I don't care. I am only a scoundrel of the pseudo-aristocratic society, and I am regarded as a charming Polish son. My father is a wretched little general, and my mother was at one time received en haut lieu. With the help of the Jew Zifel, I forged 50,000 ruble notes last year, and then I informed against him, while Julie Charpentier de Lusignan carried off the money to Bordeaux. And only fancy, I was engaged to be married. To a girl still at school, 3 months under 16, with a dowry of 90,000. Avdotia Ignatievna, do you remember how you seduced me 15 years ago when I was a boy of 14 in the Corps des Pages? Ah, that's you, you rascal. Well, you are a godsend anyway, for here. You were mistaken in suspecting your neighbor, the business gentleman, of unpleasant fragrance. I said nothing, but I laughed. The stench came from me. They had to bury me in a nailed-up coffin. Ugh, you horrid creature. Still, I am glad you are here. You can't imagine the lack of life and wit here. Quite so, quite so. And I intend to start here something original. Your Excellency. I don't mean you, Pervoyedov. Your Excellency the other one, Tarasevich, the Privy Councillor. Answer. I am Kleinovich, who took you to MLL. Fury in Lent, do you hear? I do, Kleinovich, and I am delighted, and trust me. I wouldn't trust you with a halfpenny, and I don't care. I simply want to kiss you, dear old man, but luckily I can't. Do you know, gentlemen, what this Grandpère's little game was? He died 3 or 4 days ago, and would you believe it, he left a deficit of 400,000 government money from the fund for widows and orphans. He was the sole person in control of it for some reason, so that his accounts were not audited for the last 8 years. I can fancy what long faces they all have now, and what they call him. It's a delectable thought, isn't it? I have been wondering for the last year how a wretched old man of 70, gouty and rheumatic, succeeded in preserving the physical energy for his debaucheries. And now the riddle is solved. Those widows and orphans, the very thought of them must have egged him on. I knew about it long ago. I was the only one who did know. It was Julie told me, and as soon as I discovered it, I attacked him in a friendly way at once in Easter week. Give me 25,000. If you don't, they'll look into your accounts tomorrow. And just fancy, he had only 13,000 left then, so it seems it was very apropos his dying now. Grand-père, grand-père, do you hear? Cher Kleinovich, I quite agree with you, and there was no need for you to go into such details. Life is so full of suffering and torment, and so little to make up for it, that I wanted at last to be at rest, and so far as I can see, I hope to get all I can from here too. I bet that he has already sniffed Katisha Berestov. Who? What Katisha? There was a rapacious quiver in the old man's voice. What Katish? Why, here on the left, 5 paces from me and 10 from you. She has been here for 5 days, and if only you knew, Grand-père, what a little wretch she is, of good family and breeding, and a monster, a regular monster. I did not introduce her to anyone there. I was the only one who knew her. Katicha, answer. Hey, the girl responded with a jangling laugh, in which there was a note of something as sharp as the prick of a needle. He. And a little blonde? The Grand-père faltered, drawling out the syllables. He. I have long, the old man faltered breathlessly, cherished the dream of a little fair thing of 15, and just in such surroundings. Ah, the monster, cried Avdotya Ignatievna. Enough, Kleinovich decided. I see there is excellent material. We shall soon arrange things better. The great thing is to spend the rest of our time cheerfully. But what time? Hey, you government clerk, Lebetsiatnikov, or whatever it is, I hear that's your name. Semyon Yevsych Lebetsiatnikov, lower court councillor, at your service. Very, very, very much delighted to meet you. I don't care whether you are delighted or not, but you seem to know everything here. Tell me first of all how it is we can talk. I've been wondering ever since yesterday. We are dead, and yet we are talking and seem to be moving, and yet we are not talking and not moving. What jugglery is this? If you want an explanation, Baron, Platon Nikolaevich could give you one better than I. What Platon Nikolaevich is that? To the point. Don't beat about the bush. Platon Nikolaevich is our homegrown philosopher, scientist, and master of arts. He has brought out several philosophical works, but for the last 3 months he has been getting quite drowsy, and there is no stirring him up now. Once a week he mutters something utterly irrelevant. To the point, to the point. He explains all this by the simplest fact, namely, that when we were living on the surface, we mistakenly thought that death there was death. The body revives, as it were, here, the remains of life are concentrated, but only in consciousness. I don't know how to express it, but life goes on, as it were, by inertia. In his opinion, everything is concentrated somewhere in consciousness and goes on for 2 or 3 months, sometimes even for half a year. There is one here, for instance, who is almost completely decomposed, but once every 6 weeks he suddenly utters one word, quite senseless, of course, about some Bobok. Bobok, Bobok. But you see that an imperceptible speck of life is still warm within him. It's rather stupid. Well, and how is it I have no sense of smell, and yet I feel there's a stench? That. He. Well, on that point, our philosopher is a bit foggy. It's apropos of smell, he said, that the stench one perceives here is, so to speak, moral. Hey. It's the stench of the soul, he says, that in these 2 or 3 months it may have time to recover itself. And this is, so to speak, the last mercy. Only I think, Baron, that these are mystic ravings very excusable in his position. Enough. All the rest of it, I am sure, is nonsense. The great thing is that we have 2 or 3 months more of life, and then Bobok. I propose to spend these 2 months as agreeably as possible, and so to arrange everything on a new basis. Gentlemen, I propose to cast aside all shame. Ah, let us cast aside all shame. Let us. Many voices could be heard saying, and strange to say, several new voices were audible, which must have belonged to others newly awakened. The engineer, now fully awake, boomed out his agreement with peculiar delight. The girl, Katisha, giggled gleefully. "Oh, how I long to cast off all shame," Avdotia Ignatievna exclaimed rapturously. "I say, if Avdotia Ignatievna wants to cast off all shame—" No, Kleinovitch, I was ashamed up there all the same. But here I should like to cast off shame. I should like it awfully. "I understand, Kleinovitch," boomed the engineer, "that you want to rearrange life here on new and rational principles." "Oh, I don't care a hang about that. For that, we'll wait for Kudiarov, who was brought here yesterday. When he wakes, he'll tell you all about it. He is such a personality, such a titanic personality. Tomorrow they'll bring along another natural scientist, I believe, an officer for certain, and 3 or 4 days later, a journalist, and I believe his editor with him. But deuce take them all. There will be a little group of us anyway, and things will arrange themselves. Though meanwhile, I don't want us to be telling lies. That's all I care about, for that is one thing that matters. One cannot exist on the surface without lying, for life and lying are synonymous. But here we will amuse ourselves by not lying. Hang it all, the grave has some value after all. We'll all tell our stories aloud, and we won't be ashamed of anything. First of all, I'll tell you about myself. I am one of the predatory kind, you know, all that was bound and held in check by rotten cords up there on the surface. Away with cords, and let us spend these 2 months in shameless truthfulness. Let us strip and be naked. Let us be naked. Let us be naked, cried all the voices. I long to be naked. I long to be, Avdotia Ignatievna shrilled. Ah, I see we shall have fun here. I don't want Eka after all. No, I tell you, give me a taste of life. Hey, giggled Katisha. The great thing is that no one can interfere with us, and though I see Pervoyedov is in a temper, he can't reach me with his hand. Grand-père, do you agree? I fully agree, fully, and with the utmost satisfaction, but on condition that Katish is the first to give us her biography. I protest with all my heart, General Pervoyedov brought out firmly. Your Excellency, the scoundrel Lebeziatnikov persuaded him in a murmur of fussy excitement. Your Excellency, It will be to our advantage to agree. Here, you see, there's this girl's, and all their little affairs. There's the girl, it's true, but it's to our advantage, Your Excellency. Upon my word it is. If only as an experiment, let us try it. Even in the grave, they won't let us rest in peace. In the first place, General, you were playing preference in the grave, and in the second, we don't care a hang about you, drawled Kleinvich. Sir, I beg you not to forget yourself. What? Why, you can't get at me, and I can tease you from here as though you were Julie's lapdog. And another thing, gentlemen, how is he a general here? He was a general there, but here is mere refuse. No, not mere refuse, even here. Here you will rot in the grave, and 6 brass buttons will be all that will be left of you. Bravo, Kleinovich! Ha, ha, ha! Roared voices. I have served my sovereign. I have the sword. Your sword is only fit to prick mice, and you never drew it even for that. That makes no difference. I formed a part of the whole. There are all sorts of parts in a whole. Bravo, Kleinovich, bravo, ha, ha, ha. I don't understand what the sword stands for, boomed the engineer. We shall run away from the Prussians like mice. They'll crush us to powder, cried a voice in the distance that was unfamiliar to me, that was positively spluttering with glee. The sword, sir, is an honor, the general cried, but only I heard him. There arose a prolonged and furious roar, clamour and hubbub, and only the hysterically impatient squeals of Avdotia Ignatievna were audible. But do let us make haste! Ah, when are we going to begin to cast off all shame? Oh, ho, ho! The soul does in truth pass through torments, exclaimed the voice of the plebeian, and here I suddenly sneezed. It happened suddenly and unintentionally, but the effect was striking. All became as silent as one expects it to be in a churchyard. It all vanished like a dream. A real silence of the tomb set in. I don't believe they were ashamed on account of my presence. They had made up their minds to cast off all shame. I waited 5 minutes. Not a word, not a sound. It cannot be supposed that they were afraid of my informing the police. For what could the police do to them? I must conclude that they had some secret unknown to the living, which they carefully concealed from every mortal. Well, my dears, I thought, I shall visit you again. And with those words, I left the cemetery. No, that I cannot admit. No, I really cannot. The Bobok case does not trouble me, so that is what that Bobok signified. Depravity in such a place, depravity of the last aspirations, depravity of sodden and rotten corpses, and not even sparing the last moments of consciousness. Those moments have been granted, vouchsafed to them, and worst of all, in such a place. No, that I cannot admit. I shall go to other tombs. I shall listen everywhere. Certainly one ought to listen everywhere, and not merely at one spot in order to form an idea. Perhaps one may come across something reassuring, but I shall certainly go back to those. They promise their biographies and anecdotes of all sorts. Tfu! But I shall go. I shall certainly go. It is a question of conscience. I shall take it to the Citizen. The editor there has had his portrait exhibited too. Maybe he will print it. The Monkey's Paw. 1. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlour of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn, and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess, the former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son, That's the worst of living so far out, bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence. Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathways a bog, and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter. Never mind, dear, said his wife soothingly. Perhaps you'll win the next one. Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin grey beard. There he is, said Herbert White, as the gate banged to loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it, said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him. He don't look to have taken much harm, said Mrs. White politely. I'd like to go to India myself, said the old man, just to look round a bit, you know. Better where you are, said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers, said the old man. What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris? Nothing, said the soldier hastily. Leastways nothing worth hearing. Monkey's paw, said Mrs. White curiously. Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. To look at, said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket. It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Inquired Mr. White as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. I have, he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. And did you really have the 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Persisted the old lady. The first man had his 3 wishes. Yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris, said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale. Some of them, and those who do think anything of it, want to try it first and pay me afterward. If you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly. "Would you have them?" "I don't know," said the other. "I don't know." He took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. "Better let it burn," said the soldier solemnly. "If you don't want it, Morris," said the other, "give it to me." "I won't," said his friend doggedly. "I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man." The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. "How do you do it?" he inquired. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud," said the sergeant major. "But I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like the Arabian Nights," said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the supper. "Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?" Her husband drew the talisman from pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. "If you must wish," he said gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. "If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us," said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train, "we shan't make much out of it." "Did you give him anything for it, father?" inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. "A trifle," said he, colouring slightly. "He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away." "Likely," said Herbert, with pretended horror. "Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked." He darted round the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. "I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact," he said slowly. "It seems to me I've got all I want." "If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?" said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. "Well, wish for £200 then. That'll just do it." His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman, as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. "I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. "It moved!" he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. "As I wished. It twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table. "And I bet I never shall." "It must have been your fancy, father," said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. "Never mind, though. There's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same." They sat down by the fire again while the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. "I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert as he bade them good night, "and something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains." He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. 2. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room, which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. "I suppose all old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, father?" "Might drop on his head from the sky," said the frivolous Herbert. "Morris said the things happened so naturally," said his father, "that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence." "Well, don't break into the money before I come back," said Herbert, as he rose from the table. "I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you." His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity. All of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits when she found that the post brought a tailor's bill. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said, as they sat at dinner. "I dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. "But for all that, the thing moved in my hand, that I'll swear to." "You thought it did," said the old lady soothingly. "I say it did," replied the other. "There was no thought about it. I had just, what's the matter?" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the £200, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then, with sudden resolution, flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind her and, hurriedly unfastening the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. "I was asked to call," he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Moore and Meggins." The old lady started. "Is anything the matter?" she asked, breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" Her husband interposed. There, mother," he said hastily. "Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir." And he eyed the other wistfully. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said the old woman, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that. Thank—" She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. "Yes." He sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." The other coughed, and rising, walked slowly to the window. "The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss," he said, without looking round. "I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders." There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend, the sergeant, might have carried into his first action. "I was to say that Moore and Meggins disclaim all responsibility," continued the other. "They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" £200, was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor. 3. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation as though of something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled, apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You will be cold." "It is colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. "Where? Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You've not destroyed it." "It's in the parlor, on the bracket," he replied, marveling. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've only had one." "Was not that enough?" he demanded fiercely. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "Good God, you are mad!" he cried aghast. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly, and wish, oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you're saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "A coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go and get it and wish," cried his wife, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook. "He has been dead 10 days, and besides I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?" "Bring him back," cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. "Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?" He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlor and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him. Ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way round the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish!" repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank, trembling, into a chair as the old woman with burning eyes walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time screwing up his courage, he took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended, until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, starting up. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy. It's Herbert," she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son," she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming." There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. "The bolt!" she cried loudly. "Come down! I can't reach it!" But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw, if he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.